I'm going to be talking today about automation and accessibility, debunking the myths. And for those of you who need captions, or if you know somebody who needs captions, please check the chat. There's a link in the chat that you can use to get the captions. I also created a Slack channel, so if you have any issues, go to the Slack channel. And if there's any questions that we aren't able to cover during the session, we can cover them in the Slack channel as well. I also put a link that's going to show up in the presentation later into the Slack channel, so you don't have to hurriedly try and write that down. Down the road with your backpack on your back and your sword in a sheath, and all of a sudden, out of the water in front of you, the road, this beast pops up, and you try to find a way to go around it, but you can't go around it. You have to go past it, and it's not letting you go past. So you think, okay, nothing for it. I'll just have to fight the beast. You pull out your sword, you start fighting with the beast, and after a lot of effort, you have a great success, and you cut its head off. And all of a sudden, in place of that one head, two heads grow. What does that have to do with accessibility? That's pretty much what a lot of organizations feel like when they first encounter accessibility. They see it as this unwanted challenge that they have to address somehow, and they address it as a project, and they think they're done with that project, and then all of a sudden they realize that there's not only that, but there's more projects that they probably have to do, and it's really not a project, it's a program. And so what a lot of organizations fail to do is they fail to address it in the same way that they do with other programs that require changes within their organizations, like an agile transformation. And as a result, accessibility really doesn't take root and doesn't work within the organization. And everybody wants change, right? Who wants change? I do. But very few people want to change. But unfortunately, with accessibility, as with a lot of large change programs within your organization, if you don't manage it, it's not going to happen. So really, what you need to do is you need to manage your accessibility change within your organization. I'm going to talk about some of the practices that you can use within your teams to help with this. There are a lot more practices that you can use to address at an organizational level. When we get to the bottom and I talk about my book covers both the team practices and the organizational practices that can help you to make accessibility sustainable within your organization. So what else makes accessibility difficult within organizations? Well, to a lot of organizations that recognize that it's a program and not a project, and they try to institute this, what really gets in their way is what they see as sort of the Sisyphean task of, manual accessibility testing. Every day they come to work, they do a bunch of manual accessibility testing, they go home, they come back the next day and have to pretty much start over from scratch again. And that gets in the way of being agile, of shipping software that's high quality, quickly, and causes a lot of stress within the organization. But that's because a lot of organizations are approaching accessibility testing and accessibility development in the wrong way. At DQ, we believe, and we've had great success, by taking accessibility and really embedding it into all aspects of your software development lifecycle, right at the beginning. In fact, the best way to get accessibility is to start in your design research phase by including people with disabilities in that research, and then including accessibility into your design comps and into your design process, and then including it in your development within your scrums, whether you're doing scrums, Kanban, whatever process you're using, even if you're using waterfall, including it into the development process for developers, testers, etc. And then once you have a system deployed, also monitoring the dynamic aspects of that. Perhaps you have content management that needs to be monitored as well. So you really need to integrate accessibility into all aspects of development. So I talked about design, and some of you may think, well, is there really a lot of stuff that you have to do in the design phase? Well, we'll take a look at this little component mock-up that I have over here. It's a toolbar, a horizontal toolbar, which has 3 buttons in it. One button is a little arrow pointing left. with a little bar in front of it. The next one is what looks like two vertical bars, perhaps a pause play button. And the third one is a arrow pointing right with another vertical bar. Now, everybody probably knows what that is. It's a little play toolbar, previous track, next track, and play pause. Pretty simple. How much information do you think needs to be communicated to your development teams from designers to make that accessible? Well, actually quite a lot. Let me show you. So the first thing that you need to communicate is what we call widget name, role, value, and state. So quite straightforward, that row of 3 buttons is a toolbar. But what is the name of the toolbar? If the designer doesn't communicate that to the development team, the developer has to make it up, and the tester doesn't know what to test, and most of the time it doesn't get included at all. So for somebody using a screen reader, when they encounter that toolbar, they're not going to know what they encounter because there's going to be no accessible name there. So just getting the developers to take out of their head the information that they already have, this is a toolbar, and just put it down. Make it explicit and communicate that to the development team. Allows the development team to now utilize that during development to make it accessible and to test to make sure that it's there and that it's available. And you do the same with every widget or component of a widget. So the button on the left with a little arrow and the vertical bar, that's a role equals button, and name is previous track. And the state is disabled, and you can see that visually the background in that particular button is darker than the background of the other buttons. That's what that state means, that visual communication. So the designer needs to communicate to the dev team what each of those states actually means in text so they can be included and made available to things like screen readers. So that's very important information that needs to be communicated. The second big set of information that needs to be communicated is how do you interact with those components if you're using different types of input modalities. So it might be quite straightforward and obvious how you interact with a touch or a mouse. You click this button, it activates the button. You click the play button, it turns the pause button shows up. You click the pause button, it pauses the play. But what happens with the keyboard? When you tab into that component, where does the focus go first? What happens to the focus when you click the pause play button? How do you get from one button to the other? Do you tab there? Do you use the arrow keys? That sort of detail needs to be thought through. Luckily, there are a lot of pre-built best practices for this. The ARIA authoring guidelines provide for HTML user interfaces a lot of standard interaction details, and you can just refer to those. But if you have a custom component, you need to think about this, and you need to make it explicit and communicate that to your dev team. The third big set of information that the designer really needs to think about and communicate to the dev team is what is the order of that somebody using a keyboard or something like a switch control would expect to encounter the interactive components on the page. That's what we call tab focus order. And what you can see here is a mock-up of the Axe browser extension user interface. And you can see very clearly annotated here is the order in which the tab key would allow the user using a keyboard to focus on the interactive components and then interact with them, obviously using the keyboard. So the first thing at the top left is the Axe core version. The next thing is the little control that collapses and expands the component selector functionality, all the way down through to the very last number 19 in the list over there is the more info link that somebody can click to get more info about how to fix that type of accessibility issue. So that's an example, and it's very important because as somebody is tabbing through, especially if they're using a screen reader and they're reading some of the content that's not interactive and then they're tabbing to get to the interactive content, having a bad tab order like this can make it very difficult or can make it almost impossible because it can break the meaning of the application. So I mentioned the reading order, and that's closely correlated to this focus order. And in fact, in most instances, I'd say 99.99% of the instances, you want the two to be exactly the same. Because otherwise you can really run into trouble where somebody can read some information with a screen reader and then tab and get to a control, and they think that control is associated with one thing, but it's really associated with another thing. So you need to make it explicit what the reading order is. what we do in our teams at DQ is we have this top to bottom, left to right reading order that's implicit. And only when the reading order differs from that do we actually show that there's a difference in the reading order. But that's because our teams are pretty mature. When your teams are first starting out, you'll want to do something like what I'm showing on the screen here, with every little bit of the reading order kind of laid out explicitly, thereby making it very clear what they need to do. So that's a lot of info. How do you use it, and how does it apply to these myths that we've just talked about? Well, the myth related to accessibility testing is that accessibility testing is usability testing. Now, I mentioned early on that it's very important to do usability testing and to do research with people with disabilities. But that's not the accessibility testing that you do when you release software. When you release software, you cannot rely on user testing to determine whether your software is working correctly. That's unsustainable, whether it's people with disabilities or not. Let me show you now how you can automate accessibility testing in a lot of ways, and how that ties back to what I just talked about in terms of design annotation. So the first thing to do is that, fortunately for accessibility, unlike your functionality, there are a bunch of pre-built libraries that you can use that are able to take some rules and do about 50% of, find about 50% of the issues for you completely automatically. One of them is obviously the library that we wrote, this open source library called Xcore. And we've done very many studies with this. In fact, just recently we looked at all the assessments that we did for our customers in 2019. And across all the issues that we reported to all of our customers in lots of different industries, the total percentage of those issues that we found using our automation was 57%. And when we took out the color contrast issues, which tend to be pretty high volume of issues sometimes, then it was 48%. And we've done these sorts of tests many, many times. These standard libraries can find about 50% of your issues. And so they're very helpful, and they provide a great return on investment. For your development teams, for your developers, you essentially got a pre-built set of unit tests that you can include right from the beginning. When you write your first line of code, you can include Xcore in that, and it'll find 50% of the issues. So how easy is that to do? Let me show you an example of a test using a JavaScript framework. It's a very simple functional test. Sets up the test fixture, does some functionality, gets the user interface into a particular state, and then in order to run the accessibility tests on that, we get hold of the fixture DOM element, we call ax.run, we pass the fixture into it, and in the callback to that, or in the promise that gets returned, we do some assertions. We say, for example, I expect the result violations array to have a length of 0, and that means that none of the rules returned any failures, all the rules passed. That would be a great set of tests to do. But of course, you can also use this library to generate a set of issues. If you have some legacy code and you just want to use it to get a list of errors, you can generate a list of errors, and then instead of asserting and breaking your test, you can generate a report from this. So when you're writing new code, and when we're walking down the streets of Washington, D.C. and demonstrating for accessibility, our mantra is no code merges until Axe clean. No code merges until Axe clean. And really, you can drive down the cost of your accessibility testing, your accessibility development, and your remediation efforts a huge amount just by adhering to this very simple mantra. So let's move on, because those generic accessibility libraries cannot test everything. And the thing that they cannot test is meaning. Meaning is dependent on context. So even if I'm using the same icon, for example, the little pencil icon, in one instance that may mean pencil, and in another instance it may mean edit. And you need to provide that differentiated meaning. And where does meaning come from in an application? Obviously in the content, if you're a newspaper or something, the meaning comes from the author. But in the case of an application, the meaning comes from those design annotations I talked about earlier. The designer, in combination with the product owner, is really deciding on what the meaning is. And so when you have those design annotations, and what I'm showing here is another little design annotation, a wireframe with some annotations that show me the different roles of these elements. I've got a decorative image. I've got a table which shows the recipe information about this example chocolate cake recipe. I have two buttons, one to cook, to bring up the cook dialog box, one to bring up the edit dialog box. And at the top there in green, or with the little speech bubble attached to it, it says the accessible name for this button that looks like a pencil is edit and the recipe name. So in this case, it would be edit chocolate cake. That's the meaning of that button. And so as I go across a recipe application with multiple recipes, I would hear edit chocolate cake, edit spaghetti, whatever the case may be. And you can use that as a developer now and as a tester to completely automate most of the rest of your testing. So let's see how you would do that. You take that information and you say, okay, I'm going to write a unit test. If I'm doing test-driven development, I would even write this unit test before I've written the code. I'm going to say, okay, let me find the button. That's the edit button. Let me get hold of the heading that is the heading for that particular recipe item. I'm going to calculate the accessible text for both of those. So I'm going to get the accessible text of the heading, which in our instance would have been chocolate cake. I'm going to get the accessible text of the button, and I'm going to do an assertion to make sure that the two of them are the same with the word edit. When you append the word edit, prepend the word edit and a space to the heading text. And that's a nice, robust little unit test. It doesn't depend at all on how I've implemented that button. If I've implemented using an anchor where the role is of button, if I've implemented with the input element of type equals image, or if I've implemented it as a button element with some text or an ARIA label, or maybe I've used a title attribute, it doesn't matter, because the AXE library will do that accessible name calculation for you in a way that you can be sure that it's consistent across all the different browsers and assistive technologies. And you can use that now, and you can you never have to test that with a screen reader ever again. So let's talk about device testing and assistive device testing. A lot of organizations say, we need to do a lot of manual testing with a lot of different screen readers. We know that VoiceOver and iOS is different from Android and TalkBack. Firefox and NVDA, or NVDA with Chrome, is different from JAWS with IE or Edge. And so it's very expensive to do all that testing for all the different platforms. So what we've done at DQ is we've come up with some tools. Our Axe DevTools product, for example, has what's called intelligent guided testing built into it that can allow you to do that sort of testing without having to even touch a screen reader. And then you take the things that you learned and the markup and the implementation, and you put that into unit tests like the one I've just shown you, so that you can automate the rest of it in regression. So what does that intelligent guided testing look like? And this is just one example. There are other tools that you can use that do similar things to this. But what it does is it inspects the page that you're testing, and it says, I can see some images on this page. I can see some buttons and links on this page. So I'm going to star those tests as ones that the developer or the tester needs to do, because I've found information that's relevant. But I'm also going to give them the opportunity to execute the forms tool test, because even though I didn't see a form there might be a form that you can expose in a particular state on this particular page. So it recommends certain tests to you, and then it allows you to execute other ones even if they're not there. And you can see I've executed the keyboard test on this, and it took me 1 minute to do a keyboard test on a relatively complex page. I found 2 different issues with it, but this can do in a minute with a combination of automation and asking the user questions about their application, like essentially TurboTax for accessibility. It can find a large number, amount of testing, and find a large number of issues that would normally take you, in some cases, many multiples of that time if you had to use a screen reader to do the equivalent testing. So finally, once you have done the keyboard testing manually, you also need to make sure that you have regression tests for that. So I'm showing an example here of an ARIA menu that has been implemented using jQuery in this case, using QUnit as my testing framework. And what I'm testing here is to make sure that the focus changes correctly as the user interacts using the arrow keys. So when I press the left arrow key, it needs to wrap around and go to the end of the menu bar. And when I hit the right arrow key at the end of the menu bar, it needs to wrap around and go to the beginning, etc., etc. So you can add keyboard testing in this way, so that you test during development, you use tools to help you do development, and then you have regressions tests that can be fully automated from that point on. So say you've done all your testing, your system is out there, you're just about to go into production, and somebody finds an accessibility issue. How do you make a decision as to whether you can ship with that accessibility issue or not? And how do you manage, for the purposes of, say, selling the product to the government, say the US government, who needs a voluntary product accessibility template or a VPAT? How do you manage that in an agile process? Well, the way you do that is you utilize your JIRA or equivalent system to manage all your defects. And you set up a prioritization where you can map your accessibility defects to your other defect priorities so that it becomes clear what the criteria are for doing a stop ship bug if it's an accessibility bug. So let's look at an example of that. Critical accessibility priority. The criteria for that might be at least one disability cannot complete a critical business function. So for example, if you've got an online banking system and you can't dispute a credit card charge, that might be a pretty critical business function, right? Because it can impact somebody's credit score, or impact how much money they have in the bank and whether they can pay other charges. So yeah, it sounds pretty decent. What is the action that you might take on that? Stop deployment or release of affected software until the defect is remediated if it's found before you're shipping, or if it's found in production, obviously you would have some actions that you would take in production. I'm not going to walk through all the other criteria, but you should really have analogous definitions for how you treat accessibility bugs relative to your other bugs, because everybody knows no software is bug-free, and sometimes you do have to ship with bugs. Let's just make sure that those are the bugs that we can live with if we ship them. So I'm getting to the end of talking about some of the team practices that you can put in place. I've talked about design annotation. I've talked about using standard accessibility testing libraries. I've talked about creating automated tests, using design annotation information and other things, device interaction, and I've talked about defect management. There are 5 other practices in my book that I talk about that teams can implement to help them get agile accessibility, make it sustainable, make it cost effective, as well as a set of practices, 7 practices that the organization can utilize to get accessibility adopted throughout the organization, manage the change, and give the teams the support that they need to make accessibility sustainable at an enterprise level. We are going to be putting out a new version of this book on Global Accessibility and Awareness Day, which is next week. In fact, I think today in a week. And if you go to our website on that day, you'll be able to get a free ebook version of that. If you're interested right now, you can buy the book on Amazon as well, the current version of that book on Amazon. And with that, I think I'm going to open it up to questions. All right, I see that there are 3 questions here. Any accessibility library you can use for iOS and Android platforms? Yes, there is. Our Axe DevTools product has iOS libraries that you can use. You can embed them. They have an interactive testing mode, and they also have a mode that you can use together with things like Appium. The same thing for Android. For Android, there are other alternatives out there with open source, but most of them don't really adhere to WCAG. And so we would recommend, of course, that you use something else other than some of those other open source versions if you're interested in adhering to WCAG. So does it work on browser only, or can we use Axe for unit test the code as well? Yes, you can use it for unit tests. In fact, we use it for a lot of different unit testing, React with Jest. The only thing you need to be a little bit concerned about is if you're using a non-browser DOM, like JS DOM or something like that. There are some of the tests that can be quite slow for very large pages, so you need to pay attention to that, but it works pretty well even for unit tests. We have created an in-house open source using Axe API. Can you guys collaborate for review, yeah, contact me on the SourceCon Slack, and we can talk about that. We definitely can work with you on that, give you some support on that. Is this easily integrated with testing and Appium? Yes, it is easily integrated. We integrate with almost every testing framework. For Axe DevTools, we have C# integrations, we have Java integrations, we have Ruby and JavaScript. Very many different flavors of JavaScript, WebDriver IO, WebDriver JS, etc. So in theory, we've never encountered a modern framework where we couldn't embed it. In particular, if it's built on WebDriver, Selenium, Appium, etc., it's pretty easy to integrate. Yes, we do support Espresso in Android and XUI test in iOS for our native mobile libraries. Can we use the Axe iOS library with XUI? I've just answered that. All right, I think we're out of questions. And we're also coming pretty close to out of time. Let me show you some of our connections. Connect with us at DQ Systems. My Twitter handle is @DylanBarrel, my first and my last name all together. Please connect with me there. Look forward to next week is Global Accessibility Awareness Day. We've got a lot of things going on the entire day. A lot of interesting presentations if you're interested in accessibility, so please check that out. And with that, I'm going to say thank you very much for your attention.